What if I told you that one of history's most notorious dictators believed he was destined to be the savior of the Arab world? That he saw himself not as a tyrant, but as a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar, chosen to unite 400 million Arabs under one banner? This is the complex, contradictory mind of Saddam Hussein, a man whose philosophies shaped one of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century. Saddam Hussein, former president of Iraq, Ba'athist revolutionary, and one of the most polarizing figures in modern Middle Eastern history. But beyond the headlines of wars and weapons of mass destruction lies a fascinating ideological framework that guided his actions for over 3 decades. Today we're diving deep into the philosophical foundations that drove Saddam's vision, his obsession with Arab unity, his cult of the leader necessity, his fusion of ancient Mesopotamian glory with modern nationalism, and his unique interpretation of socialism and secularism. These aren't just abstract ideas. They were the driving forces behind policies that affected millions of lives. Born into poverty in the dusty village of Al-Ajja near Tyrant in 1937, Saddam Hussein's worldview was forged in the crucible of colonial humiliation and Arab defeat. Raised by his uncle Karalit Talfa, who filled young Saddam's mind with tales of Arab heroism and hatred of foreigners, the future dictator absorbed a toxic mix of nationalism and resentment. Talfa's influence was so profound that Saddam later republished his uncle's pamphlet titled "Three Whom God Should Not Have Created: Persians, Jews, and Flies." At 20, inspired by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's brand of Arab nationalism, Saddam joined the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party in 1957. This wasn't just a political move, it was a spiritual awakening. The Ba'ath Party promised what every young Arab nationalist dreamed of: unity, freedom, and socialism. But for Saddam, these weren't just slogans, they were a roadmap to greatness. The 1967 Six-Day War, where Israel decimated Arab forces, became the defining trauma of Saddam's generation. As Nasser's prestige crumbled and Arab unity seemed more distant than ever, Saddam saw an opportunity. Iraq, with its oil wealth and ancient Mesopotamian heritage, could become the new leader of the Arab world. This wasn't just political ambition, it was destiny. Principle 1. Saddamist Ba'athism, the Iraq-centered Arab world. At the heart of Saddam's philosophy was his unique interpretation of Ba'athism, which he transformed from a pan-Arab ideology into something distinctly Iraqi-centered. Traditional Ba'athism, founded by Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Baitar in the 1940s, called for Arab unity above all else, a single Arab nation stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. But Saddam flipped the script. He argued that Arab unity could only be achieved through Iraqi leadership, making Iraq not just another Arab state, but the natural leader of the Arab nation. This ideological transformation didn't happen overnight. It evolved throughout the 1970s and 1980s as Saddam consolidated power. By the time he became president in 1979, he had systematically developed an elaborate framework that positioned Iraq as the indispensable vanguard of Arab nationalism. Where Syrian Ba'athism under Assad maintained a more orthodox interpretation of pan-Arab ideology, Iraqi Ba'athism under Saddam became increasingly particularistic and Iraq supremacist. This wasn't mere chauvinism or petty nationalism. Saddam developed an elaborate historical justification rooted in ancient history. He claimed that the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians were the ancestors of the Arabs, making Iraq the cradle of Arab civilization itself. According to this revisionist history, modern Arabs weren't just inheritors of Islamic civilization from the 7th century onward, they were the direct descendants of humanity's first great civilizations. Saddam's propagandists argued that Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria were fundamentally Arab civilizations, despite existing thousands of years before Arabs as an ethnicity emerged. In speeches and writings, Saddam repeatedly declared, Nebuchadnezzar was, after all, an Arab from Iraq, albeit ancient Iraq. This ahistorical claim allowed him to appropriate 5,000 years of Mesopotamian glory for the modern Iraqi state. In his mind, modern Iraq inherited the mantle of these great empires, and he was their legitimate heir, a modern Nebuchadnezzar destined to restore Arab glory. The comparison to Nebuchadnezzar was particularly deliberate. The ancient Babylonian king had conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the first temple, and carried the Jews into captivity. For Saddam, positioning himself as Nebuchadnezzar's successor meant positioning Iraq as the rightful leader in the struggle against Israel and Western imperialism. This wasn't just abstract ideology. Saddam invested enormous resources into making this connection tangible. In 1978, he launched the Archaeological Restoration of Babylon project, reconstructing large portions of the ancient city. He commissioned millions of bricks inscribed with his name alongside Nebuchadnezzar's. In the reign of the victorious Saddam Hussein, the President of the Republic, may God keep him the guardian of the great Iraq and renovator of its Renaissance and the builder of its great civilization. He built a modern palace directly on top of ancient ruins at Babylon, designed in the style of a Sumerian ziggurat, overlooking the Euphrates River. Baghdad was transformed into a showcase of Mesopotamian imagery. Replicas of the Ishtar Gate adorned government buildings. Museums were dedicated to Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, and sculptures from the Epic of Gilgamesh appeared throughout the capital. In the late 1980s, he promoted the Iraqi arts festival titled From Nebuchadnezzar to Saddam Hussein, explicitly drawing a direct line of leadership across millennia. He had a replica of Nebuchadnezzar's war chariot built and photographed himself standing in it. He even ordered laser light shows that projected his image alongside Nebuchadnezzar's into the Baghdad night sky. This ideology had profound political implications. It meant that Iraq wasn't seeking Arab unity as an equal partner with other Arab states. Iraq was claiming the right to lead based on historical precedent. Other Arab nations, in this worldview, should recognize Iraqi leadership just as ancient peoples recognized Babylonian supremacy. This put Saddam on a collision course with other Arab leaders, particularly Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser and later Syrian President Hafez al-Assad, who had their own visions of Arab leadership. The Iraq-centered Ba'athism also served domestic purposes. By emphasizing ancient Mesopotamian heritage, Saddam could appeal to all Iraqis, Sunni, Shiite, Christian, and even Kurd under a shared identity that transcended sectarian divisions. The pre-Islamic civilizations belonged to all inhabitants of Iraq, not just to Muslims or Arabs specifically. Yet this universalist impulse was contradictory. While claiming Babylonian and Assyrian heritage for all Iraqis, Saddam simultaneously insisted these civilizations were fundamentally Arab. This created tension with Kurdish Iraqis and Assyrian Christians who saw themselves as the actual descendants of ancient Mesopotamians. Ultimately, Saddamist Ba'athism represented a radical departure from traditional Pan-Arabism. Where Orthodox Ba'athism sought to dissolve nation-states into a unified Arab homeland, Saddam's version elevated the Iraqi state to supreme importance. Iraq wasn't just part of the Arab nation. Iraq was the Arab nation's natural leader, chosen by history itself. This philosophy would drive many of Saddam's most consequential decisions: the invasion of Iran to establish Iraqi regional dominance, the annexation of Kuwait to unite Arab oil wealth under Iraqi control, and the constant conflict with other Arab regimes who refused to acknowledge Iraqi primacy. In Saddam's mind, he wasn't simply a dictator pursuing power, he was fulfilling Iraq's 5,000-year historical destiny. Principle 2. The leader necessity, the cult of indispensable leadership. Perhaps no concept better captures Saddam's philosophy of power than the leader necessity, the idea that at certain historical moments, a single individual becomes indispensable to their people's survival and aspirations. This wasn't just political theory, it was Saddam's justification for absolute rule. The concept of al-Qaid al-Darura, or leader necessity, emerged as official Ba'athist doctrine at the party's 9th Regional Congress in 1982. According to the official formulation, the leader necessity is the man who at a certain stage represents the aspirations and basic interests of the party and the people. Therefore, it is in the interest of the party and the people to preserve this necessity and adhere to it in a sincere and genuine manner. This seemingly benign definition contained radical implications. If the leader necessity truly embodied the aspirations and interests of the people, then any opposition to him was not merely political disagreement, it was an attack on the people themselves. As Ba'athist doctrine explicitly stated, rejecting such a necessity is not an individual stance or special interpretation. Rather, it is an act aiming at inflicting direct and deliberate damage on the basic aspirations and interests of the party and people. This ideological framework transformed dissent from a political choice into treason against the nation itself. Critics of Saddam weren't simply questioning policy decisions or leadership style. They were, according to official doctrine, deliberately sabotaging Iraq's fundamental interests. This rhetorical sleight of hand eliminated any legitimate space for opposition within the political system. The leader necessity concept represented a fundamental departure from traditional Ba'athist ideology, which emphasized collective leadership and party supremacy over individual personalities. When the Ba'ath Party first came to power in 1968, decisions were made collectively, with no single person claiming primacy. The 8th Regional Congress report in the 1970s described party actions as group decisions. deliberately avoiding emphasis on individual personalities. Everything changed after Saddam assumed the presidency in 1979. The Ninth Regional Congress Report, published in 1982, rewrote recent history to position Saddam as the singular genius behind every Ba'athist success. Saddam was now retroactively credited as the mastermind who organized, planned, and took precautions for the 1968 revolution. The report declared, it was he who devised the plan, chose the time of execution, designated the roles of participants, and himself dealt the decisive blow. Hence the true birth of the revolution, which brought forth the course through which we are living today. This concept allowed Saddam to transform the Ba'ath Party from a collective leadership into a personal instrument of power, where his judgment became the supreme authority on all matters Iraqi and Arab. The party became less an ideological vanguard and more a mechanism for maintaining the leader necessity's control. The personality cult that developed around Saddam became all-consuming. Ba'athist literature described him in quasi-religious terms as possessing leadership qualities unavailable to others, fundamentally different from ordinary leaders, hallowed by inspiration and ingenuity. One party document even suggested that Saddam's birth itself was historically significant, describing it as the coincidence whereby life became transformed into political struggle. Saddam's image saturated every aspect of Iraqi public life. Thousands of portraits, posters, statues, and murals erected in his honor dominated office buildings, schools, classrooms, airports, and shops. His face appeared on all denominations of Iraqi currency. In Baghdad, the Arch of Victory featured massive crossed swords held by enormous bronze casts of Saddam's hands, creating an international symbol of his regime. He carefully crafted multiple personas to appeal to different segments of Iraqi society. He appeared in Bedouin clothing to connect with tribal traditions, in the traditional dress of Iraqi peasants to demonstrate solidarity with the rural poor, and even in Kurdish clothing to suggest national unity. He presented himself as a devout Muslim, photographed in full religious headdress praying toward Mecca. Most frequently, however, he appeared in military uniform, projecting the image of Iraq's defender despite having no formal military training. The cult extended beyond mere imagery into active historical revisionism. Saddam was credited with personally driving the first tank to assault the presidential palace during the 1968 coup, despite having no tank driving experience and not being mentioned in earlier, more honest accounts of the events. He was portrayed as the wounded hero of the 1959 assassination attempt on Qasim, swimming across the Tigris River at night with a bullet wound, disguising himself as a Bedouin to escape across the Syrian border. These mythologized accounts served dual purposes. For the masses, they created an image of a fearless, capable leader destined for greatness from childhood, a man who had carried a pistol since age 10 and showed extraordinary courage under fire. For the political elite, they conveyed a darker message. Saddam was ruthless, willing to shoot his own comrades to protect himself, and had been eliminating rivals since his youth. The leader necessity doctrine also explained why Iraq could not function without Saddam. According to Ba'athist ideology, he had become so intertwined with the state and the revolution that to criticize him was to criticize Iraq itself. This made patriotism synonymous with loyalty to Saddam personally, and dissent became not merely illegal but unpatriotic and treasonous. By the mid-1980s, the Ba'ath Party's philosophy had transformed from a political ideology into what scholars term Saddamism, comparable to Stalinism or Maoism. Political education in Iraq no longer emphasized socialist principles or Arab unity. It centered on devotion to the leader necessity. According to Ba'athist literature, Saddam Hussein is not a traditional leader. He is a defender, thinker, and human being possessing leadership qualities unavailable to others. The practical effect was the elimination of any alternative leadership. Saddam ensured he was the only nationally known figure by preventing anyone else from gaining public prominence. Even during the Iran-Iraq War, military commanders were frequently rotated to prevent any general from becoming too popular. The heroes publicized from the war were exclusively dead soldiers, capable of glorifying the state but incapable of challenging Saddam's authority. Through the leader necessity concept, Saddam had philosophically justified a totalitarian system where opposition was impossible, alternatives unthinkable, and his personal rule theoretically indispensable to Iraqi survival. Principle 3. Arab socialism with Iraqi characteristics. Saddam's version of socialism was distinctly un-Marxist. While Marx emphasized class struggle as the engine of historical change, Saddam argued that the Arab nation transcended traditional class divisions. He claimed that class conflict in the Arab world was primarily between Arabs and non-Arabs, not within Arab society itself. This ideological innovation allowed Ba'athism to reject the very foundation of Marxist-Leninist thought while still claiming the mantle of socialism. Traditional Ba'athist doctrine, as articulated by Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Baitar in the 1940s, envisioned socialism as essential to Arab unity and modernization. Article 26 of the 1947 Ba'ath Party Charter declared, "The Arab Ba'ath Party is socialist," believing that the economic wealth of the homeland belongs to the nation. However, the founders explicitly rejected Marxist materialism and atheism, arguing that Arab socialism must be rooted in Arab historical experience rather than imported European ideologies. Saddam took this framework and transformed it into something even more pragmatic and nationalist. His socialism wasn't about creating a classless society or empowering workers to control the means of production. It was about concentrating economic power in the state to serve nationalist goals. This allowed him to reject orthodox Marxist concepts like the dictatorship of the proletariat and state atheism, while embracing what he called Arab socialism. The centerpiece of Saddam's socialist program was the nationalization of Iraq's oil industry. On June 1, 1972, as vice president under Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam oversaw the seizure of international oil interests from the Iraq Petroleum Company, which had dominated the country's oil sector for decades. This wasn't merely economic policy. It was an assertion of sovereignty and anti-colonial defiance. The timing proved fortuitous. A year later, the 1973 oil crisis sent world oil prices soaring, and suddenly Iraq's nationalized oil wealth generated unprecedented revenues. Oil revenues exploded from approximately $840 million in 1970 to $860 million in 1972, then to $6.3 billion in 1974, $11.8 billion in 1976, $15.2 billion in 1978, and finally reaching $26.4 billion in 1980. By 1979, Iraq was producing 3.5 million barrels per day, and the Iraqi dinar was worth more than $3, making it one of the strongest currencies in the world. Saddam used this oil wealth to fund an ambitious modernization program that transformed Iraqi society. His socialism was more about state control of resources, particularly oil, to serve nationalist goals rather than creating a classless society. The results were impressive in the 1970s: free healthcare and education, massive infrastructure development, and a dramatic improvement in living standards. The government implemented universal free education from primary school through university, with the state guaranteeing employment to all university graduates. The National Campaign for the Eradication of Illiteracy, launched in the early 1970s, achieved remarkable results. Illiteracy rates plummeted from approximately 60% in 1968 to 1969 to just 15% by 1979 to 1980. In 1979, UNESCO awarded Iraq the Krupskaya Prize, the organization's highest honor, for successfully mobilizing the nation to eradicate illiteracy. Healthcare became free and universal. Iraq created one of the most modernized public health systems in the Middle East, earning additional recognition from UNESCO. Saddam established specialized hospitals, including facilities specifically for children with cerebral palsy. By 1976, women constituted approximately 40% of teachers, 30% of doctors, 50% of dentists, 25% of lab technicians, and 15% of accountants. Infrastructure development reached unprecedented levels. Electricity was brought to nearly every city in Iraq and many outlying areas. The government invested heavily in roads, bridges, railways, and public buildings. Agriculture was mechanized on a large scale, with land distributed to peasant farmers through cooperative systems. Before the 1970s, most Iraqis lived in the countryside and roughly two-thirds were peasants. This number decreased rapidly as modernization accelerated. Women's rights expanded dramatically under Ba'athist socialism. The 1970 Iraqi constitution formally guaranteed equal rights to women, ensuring their right to vote, attend school, and work outside the home. Article 4 of the Unified Labor Code established the right to equal pay for equal work. In 1971, a maternal law provided working women 6 months of paid maternity leave with an option for an additional 6 months unpaid. The government provided subsidized nurseries, free transportation to workplaces, and subsidized housing, primarily for professional women in the public sector. Saddam publicly championed women's participation in society, declaring, "Women make up one half of society." Our society will remain backward and in chains unless its women are liberated, enlightened, and educated. By 1974, the government decreed that all university graduates, including women, would be guaranteed automatic employment immediately following graduation. The image of university-educated women working outside the home became not just commonplace but expected as an integral part of social advancement. The government also supported families of soldiers, gave subsidies to farmers, and undertook large campaigns to beautify Baghdad by erecting statues and monuments. By the late 1970s, Iraq had experienced such significant economic growth that budget reserves surpassed $35 billion. Iraq had become the third largest economy in the Middle East by 1980. But this wasn't about equality, it was about building Iraqi power. Saddam's socialism served nationalist and militarist objectives rather than social justice. The economic system increasingly favored crony capitalism, with state resources distributed based on loyalty to the regime rather than need or merit. As one analysis noted, whatever the ideals of the first generations of Baathists in their pursuit of a strong state, it did not take long for the emergence of a class of repressive plutocrats masking their desire to consolidate power with vacuous nationalist and anti-colonial rhetoric. The social programs and infrastructure achievements of the 1970s were real and significant, earning Iraq international recognition. However, they were instruments of state power and nationalist ambition rather than expressions of socialist egalitarianism. Iraqi socialism was fundamentally about centralizing economic control to serve the states, and ultimately Saddam's vision of Iraqi regional dominance. Principle 4. Militant secularism with Islamic revival. One of Saddam's most complex philosophical positions was his relationship with Islam. As a Ba'athist, he championed militant secularism, viewing Islam as one cultural component of Arab identity rather than a governing principle. Yet he also understood Islam's political power. In 1977, faced with massive Sharia religious demonstrations in Najaf and Karbala that threatened the regime's legitimacy, Saddam delivered a series of programmatic lectures defending Ba'athist secularism. He explicitly dissociated himself from atheism but warned against any attempt to imitate religious parties, whether Sunni or Sharia. The Ba'ath party, he declared, is with faith, but it is not a religious party, nor should it be one. Saddam defined Islamic Sharia as ancient jurisprudence, insisting it was unsuitable for life in the modern age and warning that going Islamic would only divide Sunnis and Shiites. He even implied that the Ba'ath party and its secular doctrine had come to replace Islam in the modern age, echoing the teachings of party founder Michel Aflaq. In calculating political terms, Saddam explained that concessions to Islamist demands would inevitably lead the party to lose power because Ba'athists had no chance of beating the religious parties at their own game. This militant secularism defined Ba'athist ideology through the 1970s and most of the 1980s. Yet beneath the surface, pressures were building. The 1979 Iranian Revolution under Ayatollah Khomeini presented a powerful challenge, an Islamist regime successfully overthrowing a secular government and mobilizing millions through religious fervor. The 8-year Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, became as much an ideological battle as a military one, with Khomeini portraying the Iraqi Ba'athist regime as atheistic and an enemy of Islam. By the 8th Regional Party Congress in June 1982, after devastating military defeats, the Ba'ath Party frankly discussed the religious phenomenon for the first time in its history. The Congress deplored the rise of ultra-religiosity amongst Iraqi youth in general and Sharia in particular, admitting that some party members started to practice religious ceremonies in a demonstrative way, and that gradually the religious ideology won over party doctrine. The party was shocked to discover that young Ba'athists meeting with Islamist activists in mosques were at risk of conversion to Islamism. The ideological transformation accelerated in 1986. In a secret pan-Arab leadership meeting, Saddam proposed a revolutionary policy shift, seeking truce and even tacit alliance with the powerful Sudanese and Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. This was absolute anathema to a party that drew its legitimacy from Michel Aflaq, a Christian-born secularist. Tariq Aziz, the only Christian PAL member present, launched a head-on assault on Saddam's proposal, reminding colleagues that in the 1970s Saddam had clearly presented the Ba'ath position as diametrically opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood's vision of a religious state. Despite fierce internal resistance, Saddam's pragmatic calculation prevailed. By 1989, the party announced that Michel Aflaq himself had embraced Islam before his death, a claim Aflaq's own son said he was unaware of. This announcement signaled that fundamental change was coming. In 1990, with war between Iraq and a Western-led coalition looming, Saddam added "Allahu Akbar, God is greatest" to the Iraqi flag significantly, written in Saddam's own handwriting. He called for jihad against the developing Western coalition. In 1991, the government established the Iraqi Islamic Bank, and the Revolutionary Command Council decided to deduct from taxable income any sum donated to the poor according to the Islamic principle of zakat. In the 1990s, particularly after the Gulf War, Saddam launched the Faith Campaign, dramatically increasing Islamic symbolism and religious observance in Iraqi society. This wasn't religious conversion, it was political calculation. He used Islam as a tool to maintain legitimacy while keeping actual religious authorities under state control. The Faith Campaign, officially launched in mid-June 1993, introduced major changes. In September 1993, the Ministry of Interior closed 29 out of Baghdad's 45 nightclubs and all but 5 discotheques. Public consumption of alcohol was banned throughout Iraq, punishable by 1 month imprisonment. In holy Shirai cities and the Sunni quarter of Azamiya, spirits were completely prohibited. The regime launched a massive campaign to make Quran study a national intellectual focus. Saddam instructed the Ministry of Education to ensure every teacher undergo examination testing their knowledge of Islam. He ordered Quran teaching from the first grade of primary school. By June 1994, the Ministry of Awqaf had produced 60,000 new Quran textbooks. The government announced plans to prepare 30,000 Quran and Islam teachers. To elevate the status of religious education, Quran teachers received monthly allowances of 100 to 150 dinars above their regular salaries, making them the highest-paid teachers in the system. Quran studies were included in general matriculation examinations for the first time, an unprecedented decision that universities opposed to no avail. Most dramatically, Saddam forced senior Ba'ath party leadership to study Quran and undergo examinations. On July 20, 1998, Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri and many cabinet ministers participated in celebrating the third graduating faith class of senior party leadership from Saddam's Higher Institute for the Study of the Blessed Quran. One graduate emphasized that the course deepened the original aspects of the party's principle, but everyone understood party ideology was out and Islam was in. Saddam personally told a Sudanese minister in 2002, "All the judges have learned the Prophet's tradition and the Blessed Quran, and anyone who failed was excluded from the bench." And the same applied to the top cadre of the state and the party, and according to the level of the results, the fate of each of them is being decided. He even decreed that merchants must study Islamic jurisprudence and be examined, with their business fates decided by test results. In devastated, embargo-strangled Iraq, Saddam diverted enormous resources to mosque construction. The Mother of All Battles Mosque, completed in 2001, featured minarets designed to resemble Kalashnikov rifles and Scud missiles. Its crown jewel was a 605-page Quran allegedly written with 28 liters of Saddam's own blood mixed with ink and preservatives. His approach to Islam reflected a broader pattern, using traditional identities, whether tribal, religious, or regional, as instruments of control while maintaining the Ba'athist state as the supreme authority. The Faith Campaign wasn't ideological conversion, but institutional control. It was launched the exact same week as the first cohort graduated from Saddam University for Islamic Studies, which the regime had created to produce loyal religious leaders. These graduates were placed throughout Iraq's religious landscape to deliver regime-approved messages. As one scholar concluded, the Faith Campaign should really not be seen as an ideological shift toward Islamism, as many have seen it. It was, in fact, an attempt by the regime to fight the rising tide of Islamism in the region. Yet the campaign took on a life of its own, and Iraqi society became genuinely more religiously radicalized throughout the 1990s. By weaponizing Islam for political purposes, Saddam ultimately strengthened the very forces that would later fuel sectarian insurgency. Principle 5. Revolutionary violence as historical necessity. Saddamism was built on the principle that political change required violence. The ideology was militarist, viewing political disputes as battles requiring fighting, mobilization, battlefields, and trenches. This wasn't just rhetoric, it was a fundamental worldview that saw politics as warfare by other means. The roots of this militant ideology trace back to Ba'athism's founding principles. Michel Aflaq, the movement's Christian-born intellectual architect, believed in revolutionary transformation of Arab society through struggle and sacrifice. However, there was a profound tension in Aflaq's philosophy. While he emphasized internal spiritual struggle and transformation, His followers increasingly externalized this violence into literal revolutionary action. By the 1960s, particularly with the rise of neo-Ba'athism in Syria, the movement had transformed into something far more explicitly violent. The 1966 Syrian coup, which killed approximately 400 people, marked Ba'athism's complete transformation into a militarist organization. The new generation of radical leftist leaders, heavily influenced by Marxist-Leninist revolutionary theory, viewed violence not as regrettable but as essential to revolutionary change. Saddam Hussein absorbed these lessons and refined them into a distinctly Iraqi approach. His philosophy of violence was coldly instrumental. Every act of brutality served specific political objectives. As one psychological analysis noted, atrocious acts were Saddam Hussein's hallmark throughout his reign. Helped by his oil wealth, he became a nation builder, but he grounded that nation on violence, terror, and a paramount quest for control. The 1979 Ba'ath Party purge, also called the Comrades Massacre, exemplified this philosophy in its most chilling form. 6 days after assuming the presidency on July 16, 1979, Saddam orchestrated a theatrical purge at Al-Quld Hall in Baghdad. Approximately 100 unsuspecting Ba'ath Party members gathered to hear their new president speak. A man was then brought before the assembly, Mohi Abdul Hussein Mashhadi, visibly bearing signs of torture, displaying what witnesses described as a vacant stare indicative of a shattered mind and spirit. This broken man began confessing to a Syrian-backed conspiracy to overthrow Saddam, naming supposed accomplices one by one. As each name was called, uniformed guards led the accused out of the hall. The atmosphere became surreal and terrifying. The remaining attendees, understanding their survival depended on demonstrating absolute loyalty, began chanting fervent support for Saddam. Those who survived this brutal purge were then handed firearms and commanded to execute their condemned colleagues, thus becoming participants in their leader's atrocities. Journalist Christopher Hitchens likened this event to Hitler's Night of the Long Knives in 1934. 21 men were ultimately executed by firing squad. A videotape of the assembly and executions was distributed throughout the country as a warning. In early August 1979, Saddam appeared on the balcony of the presidential mansion to inform a chanting crowd of 50,000 supporters that he had just witnessed the executions, and the crowd cheered. This wasn't random sadism. Saddam's use of violence wasn't random brutality, it was instrumental, calculated to achieve specific political objectives. The purge eliminated potential rivals, intimidated the surviving leadership into absolute obedience, and established Saddam's willingness to destroy anyone who challenged him. By forcing survivors to execute their colleagues, Saddam bound them to his regime through complicity in. This instrumental violence extended to Iraq's ethnic and religious minorities. Whether purging Ba'ath Party rivals, crushing Kurdish and Shia uprisings, or launching wars against Iran and Kuwait, violence was always in service of his broader philosophical goals of Arab unity under Iraqi leadership. The Anfal campaign of 1988 represented revolutionary violence on a genocidal scale. This counterinsurgency operation, directed by Ali Hassan al-Majid, later known as Chemical Ali, targeted Kurdish communities in northern Iraq. The campaign involved the destruction of over 4,000 villages, mass killings, and widespread use of chemical weapons, resulting in the deaths of more than 180,000 Kurdish civilians. The Kurdish population was specifically targeted because of their ethnic identity and long-standing resistance to the Iraqi government. They sought to preserve their language, culture, and autonomy within Iraq, aspirations that Saddam's regime viewed as threats to Ba'athist centralization and Arab nationalist ideology. The Anfal operation culminated in the Halabja massacre on March 16, 1988. Iraqi forces utilized mustard gas and nerve agents including sarin, tabun, and VX against the civilian population. The assault claimed the lives of between 3,200 and 5,000 civilians, including women and children, and injured 7,000 to 10,000 others. To date, Halabja remains the largest chemical weapons attack directed against a civilian-populated region in human history. In 2010, the Supreme Iraqi Criminal Tribunal officially defined it as a genocidal massacre against the Kurdish people. Yet from Saddam's perspective, this wasn't genocide, it was necessary revolutionary violence to preserve Iraqi territorial integrity and crush separatist threats. The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, represented violence as revolutionary ideology on an international scale. Saddam justified the invasion not merely as self-defense but as a necessary step to establish Iraqi leadership in the Gulf, contain Iranian revolutionary Islam, and seize oil-rich territories. The war killed over 1 million people, yet Saddam framed it as a historic struggle for Arab civilization against Persian expansionism. The 1990 invasion of Kuwait followed similar ideological logic. Conventional wisdom holds that Saddam invaded simply to escape dire economic straits and seize Kuwait's oil wealth. However, recent scholarship reveals Saddam genuinely believed in an American-led conspiracy involving Kuwait to weaken Iraq economically before an Israeli military strike. In his mind, seizing Kuwait wasn't merely opportunistic aggression, it was preemptive defense against imperialist conspiracy. As Saddam privately told one visitor in fall 1990, "The battle is broader than Kuwait," implying the invasion addressed the larger American-led conspiracy rather than just Kuwait itself. This reflected his fundamental worldview. Violence wasn't brutality but revolutionary necessity in service of Iraqi sovereignty and Arab liberation. Throughout his reign, Saddam maintained that terror and violence were essential tools of statecraft. As one analysis concluded, Saddam's grasp of the mechanics of terror explained his political longevity. He created a national culture where one participated, or one was eliminated. And participating meant propagating yet more suspicion and mistrust, creating, and killing off, yet more scapegoats. This philosophy of revolutionary violence as historical necessity ultimately defined Saddamism as an ideology. Politics was war, opponents were enemies to be eliminated, and the revolutionary transformation of Iraq justified any means necessary. Violence wasn't a regrettable side effect of political struggle, it was the very essence of revolutionary change. Principle 6: Anti-imperialism and Third World leadership. Central to Saddam's worldview was fierce opposition to Western imperialism and Zionism. He positioned Iraq as the leader of the global South, drawing inspiration from figures like Castro, Ho Chi Minh and Tito, not for their communism, but for their defiance of Western domination. This anti-imperialist stance wasn't just foreign policy, it was the foundation of his domestic legitimacy. By presenting himself as the defender of Arab dignity against Western and Zionist conspiracies, Saddam could justify authoritarian rule as necessary for national survival. Saddam's anti-imperialism drew directly from Ba'athist ideology, which identified anti-imperialism and anti-Zionism as core principles alongside Arab nationalism and socialism. Michel Aflaq, Ba'athism's founder, viewed Western colonialism as having artificially divided the Arab nation and implanted Israel as a permanent outpost of imperialism in the Arab homeland. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 became a central symbol in Saddam's anti-imperial rhetoric. This secret treaty between Britain and France divided Ottoman Arab lands into spheres of influence, creating artificial borders that ignored ethnic, religious, and tribal realities. Iraq itself was cobbled together from 3 Ottoman provinces, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, into a single state that forced Sunni Arabs, Shiite Arabs, and Kurds into an artificial political unit. Saddam frequently invoked Sykes-Picot as evidence of Western imperialism's continuing effects. He argued that the modern Middle Eastern state system was an illegitimate colonial imposition designed to keep Arabs weak and divided. In this narrative, Iraq's attempts to unite Arab territories, whether through ideological influence or military force, represented legitimate resistance to colonial fragmentation rather than aggression. This anti-imperial ideology placed fierce opposition to Israel at the center of Saddam's worldview. Ba'athism viewed Zionism as a form of European settler colonialism, with Israel serving as an outpost for Western imperial interests in the Arab world. Unlike other Arab leaders who eventually made pragmatic accommodations with Israel, Saddam maintained absolute rejection of any recognition or normalization. Following the fall of Saddam in 2003, Syria would become the last anti-Zionist and truly Ba'athist nation in the Arab world. Until then, Iraq under Saddam represented one of the last bastions of uncompromising Arab nationalist opposition to Israel. Saddam positioned himself as the champion of the Palestinian cause, providing substantial financial and political support to the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO's former treasurer testified that he witnessed Saddam Hussein personally hand Yasser Arafat a $50 million check for supporting Iraq during the First Gulf War. According to other accounts, Saddam gave Arafat $150 million in 3 payments, handed to Arafat personally. Most dramatically, during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, Saddam instituted a policy of paying $25,000 to the family of every Palestinian bomber who attacked Israeli targets. This wasn't merely symbolic support, it was direct material incentive for violent resistance against Israel. Iraqi television regularly featured Palestinian officials like Foreign Minister Farouk Kaddoumi, thanking Saddam Hussein for his generous support to the Palestinian cause. Saddam's support for the Palestinian cause served multiple purposes. It burnished his credentials as a champion of Arab nationalism and anti-imperialism. It provided ideological justification for his authoritarian rule, presenting Iraq as locked in existential struggle against Western-backed Zionism. And it offered a unifying external enemy around which to mobilize Iraqi society. Beyond Palestine, Saddam sought to position Iraq as a leader of the non-aligned movement and the broader Third World. The non-aligned movement, founded in 1961 by Tito, Nehru, Nasser, Nkrumah, and Sukarno, represented countries refusing alignment with either the United States or Soviet Union during the Cold War. Fidel Castro's Havana Declaration of 1979 articulated the movement's purpose: to ensure the national independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of non-aligned countries in their struggle against imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, and all forms of foreign aggression, occupation, domination, interference, or hegemony, as well as against great power and bloc politics. This rhetoric aligned perfectly with Saddam's worldview. Iraq's oil nationalization in 1972, its support for Palestinian liberation, its resistance to Western pressure, and its military buildup all positioned the country as a model of Third World defiance. However, Saddam's anti-imperialism was highly selective and instrumental. During the Iran-Iraq War, he accepted massive military and financial support from Western powers, including the United States, France, and Britain. He purchased Soviet weapons while denouncing communist ideology. His anti-imperialism was directed primarily at powers he perceived as threatening Iraqi interests, not at imperialism as a universal principle. His invasion of Kuwait in 1990, disastrous though it proved, was consistent with this philosophy, an attempt to challenge Western-imposed borders and unite Arab oil resources under Iraqi leadership. Saddam genuinely believed in an American-led conspiracy involving Kuwait to weaken Iraq economically before an Israeli military strike. In private conversations, he told visitors, "The battle is broader than Kuwait," suggesting the invasion addressed a larger imperialist conspiracy rather than just territorial ambition. Saddam attempted to frame the Kuwait invasion in anti-imperialist terms, calling for jihad against the developing Western coalition and linking the Gulf crisis with Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. Palestinians largely supported Iraq during the Gulf War, motivated by Saddam's linkage of the conflicts and his material support for their cause. Yet this support proved catastrophic for Palestinians. The Kuwaitis financed a massive media campaign calling Arafat a traitor for supporting Saddam. Gulf Arab states, which had been major financial backers of the PLO, cut off funding. After Iraq's defeat in 1991, the PLO found itself diplomatically isolated and financially devastated, with little choice but to negotiate with Israel, the exact opposite of what Saddam's anti-imperialist stance had promised. This revealed the fundamental contradiction in Saddam's anti-imperialism. While he positioned himself as the defender of Arab dignity and Third World sovereignty, his actual policies often weakened both. The Iran-Iraq War lost life over 1 million people and devastated 2 major oil-producing nations. The Kuwait invasion brought massive Western military intervention into the Gulf, exactly what anti-imperialists supposedly opposed. As one analysis concluded, Saddam's anti-imperialism served primarily to justify authoritarian control and aggressive foreign policy, rather than genuinely advancing Third World liberation. His invocation of colonial injustice and Western conspiracies provided ideological cover for actions that ultimately enabled greater Western intervention in the Middle East. Principle 7: Modernization through authoritarian development. Despite his reputation for brutality, Saddam genuinely believed in modernizing Iraqi society. His philosophy combined authoritarian control with ambitious development programs, viewing the Ba'athist state as the engine of social transformation. Saddam's organizational prowess was credited with Iraq's rapid pace of development in the 1970s, which went forward at such a fevered pitch that 2 years' worth of construction projects were sometimes initiated within a single year. From the early 1970s, Saddam was widely recognized as the power behind President al-Bakr, who after 1977 was little more than a figurehead. As vice chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, Saddam built a reputation as a progressive, effective politician who took a leading role in addressing the country's major domestic problems. At the center of this strategy was Iraq's oil. On June 1, 1972, Saddam oversaw the seizure of international oil interests, which at the time dominated the country's oil sector. A year later, world oil prices rose dramatically as a result of the 1973 energy crisis, and skyrocketing revenues enabled Saddam to expand his agenda. Saddam subsequently implemented a national infrastructure campaign that made progress in building roads, promoting mining, and developing other industries. Under his rule, Iraq experienced massive infrastructure development. Electrification reached nearly every city, literacy rates soared, and women's rights expanded significantly. Electricity was brought to nearly every city in Iraq, and many outlying areas. Before the 1970s, most of Iraq's people lived in the countryside and roughly two-thirds were peasants. This number would decrease quickly during the 1970s. The government built a modern educational system of schools and universities, a modern medical system of hospitals and clinics, and an extensive infrastructure of roads and railroads, electrical power grids, irrigation systems, petrochemical and other industries, luxury hotels, public buildings, radio and TV systems, airports, and middle-class housing developments. By the 1970s, Iraq boasted a well-functioning water and sanitation system which could deliver safe drinking water to approximately 90% of the population. During the 1970s, Iraq made extensive investment in the water sector and other infrastructure using the proceeds of oil revenue, leaving Iraq in 1990 with a relatively modern electrical, water supply and sewerage system. Before 1991, UNICEF estimates that 95% of urban dwellers and 75% of rural dwellers were served by modern water supply systems that delivered treated water to homes and businesses. Healthcare became a particular point of pride. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Iraqi government directed a significant portion of its growing oil revenue to support public healthcare delivery and institutions. By the late 1980s, Baghdad's centralized public healthcare network reached nearly 97% of the urban population and 79% of rural communities. Iraq's public health system became a regional leader as healthcare was made free, a feat that earned Saddam an award from UNESCO. Education became public and free on all levels, with hundreds of thousands of Iraqis learning to read within a few years. By 1980, the literacy rate reached 70% and primary school enrollment was 100%. The oil economy, fertile land, abundant water and an educated population made Iraq one of the richest and most highly developed countries in the Middle East. As medical staff and the institutions where they worked developed, so too did the communication and supply network supporting them. With the expansion of Iraqi infrastructure, healthcare facilities were linked by reliable and efficient modes of road and rail transportation, allowing for experts and patients to move between regions with relative ease. Saddam focused on fostering loyalty to the Ba'athists in the rural areas. After nationalizing foreign oil interests, Saddam supervised the modernization of the countryside, mechanizing agriculture on a large scale, and distributing land to peasant farmers. The Ba'athists established farm cooperatives and the government also doubled expenditures for agricultural development in 1974 to 1975. The government supported farmers by providing massive subsidies. By the late 1970s, Iraq had experienced significant economic growth, with budget reserves surpassing $35 billion. The value of one Iraqi dinar was worth more than $3, making it one of the most notable economic expansions in the region. Saddam Hussein's regime aimed to diversify the Iraqi economy beyond oil, investing in various industries including petrochemicals, fertilizer production, and textile manufacturing to reduce dependence on oil revenues and promote economic self-sufficiency. A government-sponsored women's movement promoted women's education and the entry of women into the workforce. Saddam declared, "Women make up one half of society. Our society will remain backward and in chains unless its women are liberated, enlightened and educated." According to The Economist, much as Adolf Hitler won early praise for galvanizing German industry, ending mass unemployment and building autobahns, Saddam earned admiration abroad for his deeds. He had a good instinct for what the Arab Street demanded. Following the decline in Egyptian leadership brought about by the trauma of Israel's six-day victory in 1967, the death of the pan-Arabist hero Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1970, and the traitorous drive by his successor Anwar Sadat to sue for peace with Israel. This wasn't liberalism, it was technocratic authoritarianism, using state power to rapidly modernize society in service of national strength. Saddam's vision was that Iraq first would concentrate exclusively on economic, technological and military growth, turning itself into a regional superpower. The modernization campaign served multiple strategic objectives beyond simple social welfare. The Ba'ath Party functioned as the eyes and ears of the government, gaining influence over the military, the government bureaucracy, labor, and professional unions. One of the party's most important functions was gathering information about its opponents. In a carrot-and-stick approach, all the while Saddam was strengthening his grip on society. Outside of Baghdad, party branches were legally authorized to incarcerate suspects using extrajudicial procedures. They tried to recruit members from Kurd-dominated areas through supplying food or literacy campaigns, mixing development with political control. Official party membership figures must be interpreted within the context of an authoritarian system in which political affiliation often functioned as a prerequisite for access to education, employment, and advancement within state institutions. Consequently, the party operated not only as an ideological vanguard, but also as a mechanism of patronage and surveillance. The modernization philosophy drew on Ba'athist ideology's emphasis on using state power to rapidly transform society. Unlike liberal development models that prioritized individual freedom and market forces, Saddam's approach viewed the authoritarian state as the necessary vehicle for dragging Iraqi society from backwardness into modernity. This model achieved genuine results in the 1970s. Baghdad and some other cities became newer and more modern than many U.S. cities. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, Iraq led the Middle East in development of infrastructure, social services, and healthcare. Yet after years of successive wars and sanctions, this impressive infrastructure crumbled. The March 2003 invasion produced further degradation of Iraq's water supply, sewerage, and electrical supply systems. Treatment plants, pumping stations, and generating stations were stripped of their equipment by looters, and the once capable cadre of engineers and operating technicians were scattered or left the country. Saddam's modernization philosophy ultimately revealed a fundamental contradiction. Authoritarian development could build impressive physical infrastructure, but it created a system entirely dependent on oil revenues, personal loyalty networks, and coercive control. When wars, sanctions, and eventually invasion disrupted these foundations, the impressive modernization achievements of the 1970s collapsed with stunning speed. Critique and counter-arguments. Of course, Saddam's philosophical framework had devastating flaws and contradictions. His concept of the leader necessity was ultimately a sophisticated justification for personal dictatorship. From the mid-1980s, the Ba'athist's philosophy and political education came to embody a cult rather than a political ideology. Given his crucial role after taking over the presidency in 1979 until he was overthrown in April 2003, one could legitimately call those 24 years a period of Saddamism, similar in form to Stalinism or Maoism. The man who claimed to represent Arab unity spent much of his career fighting other Arabs, from Syrian Ba'athists to Kuwaiti civilians. Despite their shared Ba'athist roots, the Syrian and Iraqi branches were bitter rivals. Syria supported Iran during its war with Iraq in the 1980s, revealing how hollow the rhetoric of Arab unity had become. In 1990, for the first time, one Arab state had brazenly tried to annex another, cynically and implausibly claiming that the action served the cause of Arab unity. The intense rivalry for leadership in the Arab world between Iraq and Syria became particularly open after the death of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1970. On March 20, 1972, Iraqi President Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr approached Syria and Egypt with a proposal to establish unity between these countries. However, during negotiations led by Saddam Hussein, it became clear that Iraq's unity project was fundamentally different from Syria's plan. The Syrian side invited Iraq to join the Federation of Arab Republics, subject to agreement with all its principles, which actually meant accepting the leadership of Syria. In response, Iraq stated that it was not seeking full state unification, effectively demanding Iraqi supremacy rather than genuine partnership. This revealed that on the issue of Arab unity, Iraq could only unite with those countries that had political systems identical to it and accepted Iraqi leadership. Often in Saddam's policies, there was a deep gap between the declared principles and their practical implementation. The radicalism of official Baghdad on Arab unity not only placed Iraq in isolation in the Arab world, but also sometimes created obstacles to inter-Arab integration and cooperation. His version of socialism became a tool for enriching his family and tribal allies while ordinary Iraqis suffered under sanctions and war. Rather than an ideology-based regime like Nazism or communism, it was a kind of psychotic gangsterism with Saddam at the head, but the two sons just able to do really whatever they please with immense power at their disposal. Saddam's eldest son Uday controlled much of the surviving consumer goods market in Iraq, owned a Baghdad newspaper and television station, and headed the Iraqi Olympic Committee. Witnesses described scenes where Uday used his power to kidnap young girls, torture friends for minor transgressions, and commit death with impunity. His younger son Qusay, who controlled Iraq's intelligence services and security forces, personally interrogated prisoners, men, women, and children stripped naked in warehouses, shooting them if they didn't give satisfactory answers. According to defectors, the floor was just awash with blood. This family corruption extended to the highest levels of the regime. The infrastructure and social programs Saddam boasted about crumbled under the weight of military spending and international isolation. More of Iraq's economic infrastructure was destroyed in 6 weeks of Allied bombing during the 1991 Gulf War than in the 8 years of war with Iran. Sanctions further eroded the economy, and the once impressive infrastructure of the 1970s stood on the brink of collapse by the late 1990s. The UN Oil for Food program, established in 1995 to alleviate humanitarian suffering, became corrupted at every level. Saddam's regime reaped approximately $1.8 billion in kickbacks, while unchecked smuggling generated $8.4 billion in profits for the Hussein family and their associates. The program that was supposed to feed hungry Iraqis instead enriched the very regime responsible for their suffering. Dennis Halliday, former UN humanitarian coordinator for Iraq who resigned in disgust in 1998, estimated that by 1999 the destruction of Iraq's infrastructure and UN sanctions had directly caused the deaths of 600,000 children. The massive rise in unemployment during the 1990s spurred an increase in Iraqi bureaucrats charging for access to public services, creating new patterns of corruption that continue to this day. Most critically, Saddam's anti-imperialism often served imperialist ends. His wars weakened the Arab world and ultimately enabled greater Western intervention in the Middle East. The Iran-Iraq War alone lost life over 1 million people, hardly advancing the cause of Arab unity he claimed to champion. Estimates of total casualties in the Iran-Iraq War range from 1 million to twice that number. The number lost life on both sides was perhaps 500,000, with Iran suffering the greatest losses. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 100,000 Kurds were lost life by Iraqi forces during the Anfal campaign in 1988. The incredibly deadly and destructive nature of the conflict left a long legacy, including the proliferation in the development of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and Iran. The war placed tremendous strain on both countries' resources, a factor that precipitated Iraq's later invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Rather than advancing Arab power, Saddam's militarism drained resources, lost life hundreds of thousands, and created the conditions for Western intervention. The cult of personality that emerged around Saddam transformed Ba'athist ideology into empty sloganeering. By the 1980s, genuine political discourse had been replaced by ritual displays of loyalty to the leader necessity. The cult was created as a result of the decline of Nasserist pan-Arab ideology and Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath party's careful calculation in their promotion of Iraqi nationalism over pan-Arabism. The base of Iraqi nationalism, which had been carefully cultivated under Saddam, served to free the Iraqi leadership from the constraints of a higher ideology. The interests of the nation needed to be redefined, and Saddam ensured that he alone would define the goals of Iraq. His judgment reigned supreme, unconstrained by any group or institution. This transformation represented the complete corruption of Ba'athist ideals. What began as a movement for Arab unity, socialism, and liberation from imperialism became a vehicle for one man's unlimited power. The philosophical sophistication of concepts like the leader necessity and Iraq-centered Arab nationalism could not disguise their essential function, justifying dictatorship, enriching a corrupt elite, and mobilizing Iraqis for wars that devastated the region. Ultimately, Saddam's philosophical framework failed on its own terms. It did not unite the Arabs but divided them, did not liberate Iraq from imperialism but invited it, did not build a modern socialist state but created a corrupt kleptocracy, and did not elevate Iraq to regional leadership but destroyed its society. So what can we learn from the philosophies of Saddam Hussein? His story reveals how noble ideals, Arab unity, anti-imperialism, social development, can be corrupted when combined with authoritarian power and cult of personality. It shows how sophisticated political theories can become tools of oppression when unchecked by democratic accountability. Perhaps most importantly, Saddam's philosophy reminds us that understanding our opponents requires looking beyond simple labels of good and evil. Even the most brutal dictators operate within ideological frameworks that make sense to them, and recognizing these frameworks is essential for preventing future tragedies. The Middle East today still grapples with many of the issues Saddam claimed to address: foreign intervention, sectarian division, economic dependency, and the search for authentic Arab leadership. Understanding how one man's answers to these challenges led to decades of suffering offers crucial lessons for building a more peaceful future. What do you think? Can revolutionary ideologies ever justify authoritarian means? How do we distinguish between genuine anti-imperialism and cynical power politics? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the complex minds that shaped our world.